Scene: the U.S. Constitutional Review Court. The audience murmurs quietly. Cameras focus on the bench as Judge Margaret Leland enters. The bailiff announces, "Hebo ALIFF, all rise." The United States Constitutional Review Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Margaret Leland presiding. Everyone stands. The judge sits. UDG Margaret, please be seated. Today, this court hosts a special public hearing under the title, "Who Really Defines Justice?" A discussion between two esteemed figures. On one side, Professor Alan Dershowitz, renowned constitutional scholar and defense attorney. On the other, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, advocate for legislative reform and social equity. The purpose of this session is not to determine guilt or innocence, but to challenge the very framework of justice itself, whether it lies in law or in morality. Professor Dershowitz, you may begin. Elan Dershowitz. Thank you, Your Honor. Justice, in its purest form, is not emotion. It is principle, a balance between freedom and responsibility. For centuries, our legal system has stood as the most refined attempt to translate morality into rule. I have argued before courts from Boston to The Hague, and one truth endures: without structure, justice becomes vengeance. When public sentiment dictates verdicts, when outrage replaces evidence, society collapses into mob rule. Justice cannot belong to whoever shouts the loudest. It must be defined through precedent, logic, and constitutional boundaries. Today, many claim that the legal system is broken because it fails to satisfy emotional expectations. I disagree. The system is not perfect. No human creation is. But its foundation, due process, ensures that truth is not drowned by passion. Congresswoman Crockett, I respect your activism. But when you say, justice must evolve, I caution: if it evolves beyond law, it becomes anarchy. Jasmine Crockett. Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Dershowitz, I appreciate your decades of experience, but justice has already evolved. Because society has. When you speak of structure, I hear control. When you speak of precedent, I hear privilege. The law you defend was written in a time when people like me couldn't even speak in this room, much less sit in Congress. So I ask you, if justice was defined by the powerful, how can it ever serve the powerless? You call emotion dangerous, but emotion is not chaos. It's humanity. The people who fill our prisons, who lose their homes, who suffer under unjust policies, they live the consequences of a system that calls itself fair, while hiding behind cold procedure. Justice is not just about what is legal, it's about what is right. Elan Dershowitz. Congresswoman, I agree that the system must be challenged constantly. That challenge must occur within its own framework, not outside it. The moment you replace law with moral intuition, you hand over justice to interpretation, and interpretation, however noble it may seem, is the soil where bias grows. For every good intention, there exists another claiming righteousness. Hitler claimed he was restoring justice to Germany. Revolutionaries have justified terror in the name of justice. If every citizen decides for themselves what is just, then the concept itself dissolves. Jasmine Crockett, but Professor, who wrote that framework you so passionately defend? Let's be honest. Our legal code was shaped by men who excluded women, enslaved Black Americans, criminalized entire communities. When the foundation is biased, the structure cannot be neutral. I'm not arguing for chaos. I'm arguing for balance. For centuries, law has leaned toward protecting power. What I and millions of others demand is that it finally lean toward protecting people. When we challenge due process, it's not because we despise order. It's because we recognize that the process itself has not been equally applied. Dershowitz. That's a fair critique, and one I share to an extent. The system has indeed failed many. The solution is not to redefine justice by ideology. Justice must remain blind to race, gender, wealth, and politics. Once you lift the blindfold, you introduce partiality, however noble your cause. History shows us that revolutions fueled by moral certainty often replace one injustice with another. If law once favored the rich, the answer isn't to create a law that now favors the poor. It's to create a law that favors no one. Jasmine Crockett. And yet, blind justice often turns its head away from what it doesn't want to see. You say justice should favor no one, but when black men are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated for the same crimes as their white counterparts, justice is favoring someone. When corporations pollute entire towns and walk free, but single mothers are jailed over minor infractions, justice is favoring someone. We can't pretend the scales are balanced when the weight of history still tips them. Jodge Margaret, order, please. She looks between them. Professor, Congresswoman, both of you raise critical points. Let's stay within the central question: who defines justice? The legislature, the courts, or the people? Professor Dershowitz, your response. Elan Diarstola Sierra, Your Honor, justice must be defined by principle, not passion. The Constitution defines it. The courts interpret it. If we hand the definition to the people directly, to public opinion, we risk the tyranny of emotion. Laws must outlast outrage. I teach my students the law is there to protect the guilty as much as the innocent. Because in protecting the guilty, we protect ourselves from arbitrary power. If we abandon that for emotional satisfaction, we trade freedom for fury. Jasmine Crockett. But, Professor, emotional satisfaction is not what the people want. Accountability is. You speak of protecting the guilty, but where is that same energy when the powerful go unpunished? When police kill unarmed citizens and walk free? When corporations exploit workers and settle in silence? When politicians break laws they helped write? You defend the system's integrity, but I question its loyalty. Who does it truly serve? If justice cannot be felt by the people, then it's just a performance. Elan Dershowitz. Justice is not a feeling, Congresswoman. It's a process. You cannot build fairness on fury, nor truth on perception. You can reform law, but you cannot replace it with the pulse of the moment. We must strengthen institutions, not dismantle them. Otherwise, you may one day find yourself at the mercy of the very chaos you invited. Jasmine Crockett. And yet, Professor, sometimes chaos is what forces change. The civil rights movement was called chaos. Women demanding the vote were called chaotic. History doesn't move politely. It moves because someone dared to disrupt the peace of injustice. You call it dangerous. I call it necessary. The courtroom murmurs. The judge lightly taps the gavel. He Judge Margaret, order. Both sides will pause here. The opening statements have been heard. This court acknowledges that the question before us, who defines justice, cannot be answered without addressing both the foundation of law and the voice of the people. We will reconvene after a brief recess. BILFF, all rise. The court is now back in session. Judge Margaret, please be seated. This session continues our public hearing on who really defines justice. The floor is now open for direct rebuttals. Congresswoman Crockett, you may proceed. Jasmine Crockett. Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Dershowitz began by saying justice must remain bound by the Constitution. By law, not by emotion. But the law, as we both know, is not sacred text. It's a living contract written by imperfect hands. For generations, people suffered under laws that were perfectly legal. Slavery was legal. Segregation was legal. Women denied the right to vote, legal. Unions crushed by police, legal. So when you insist that justice must live within the boundaries of law, I must ask, what happens when the law itself is unjust? Elan Dartz. That is a valid question, one every democracy must face. The answer, Congresswoman, lies in the process of change through legality. Slavery did not end because someone disregarded the law. It ended because the Constitution itself evolved. Through the 13th Amendment, through legitimate democratic means. The law can correct itself, that is its strength. When you burn the foundation, you may gain temporary satisfaction, but you destroy the very structure capable of reform. Jasmine Crockett. But reform comes only when pressure is applied from the outside. Do you believe those amendments appeared out of moral reflection alone? No, they came because people broke the silence, because they demanded justice louder than the law allowed. Without rebellion, the system would have remained comfortable in its injustice. I'm not advocating lawlessness. I'm advocating accountability. Drcoytz, accountability is the lifeblood of justice, but it must be achieved through reason, not outrage. You speak of rebellion as progress, yet every rebellion creates collateral damage. Innocents suffer. That is why civilized nations build systems to contain that energy. The courtroom is the ultimate rebellion against chaos. It channels conflict into words, into evidence, into reasoning. Jasmine Crockett, and yet, Professor, how often do those courtrooms serve only those who can afford them? Justice isn't just about ideals. It's about access. When a billionaire commits fraud, they hire a fleet of lawyers. When a single mother misses a rent payment, she faces eviction alone. When a protester demands fairness, they're branded as disruptive. So tell me, Professor, how can justice claim neutrality when wealth determines who can fight for it? Darshowitz, you're absolutely right. The imbalance of access is a moral failure of our time. But again, the answer is not to destroy the system, but to equip it better. We can fund public defenders more effectively. We can limit corporate immunity. We can hold prosecutors accountable. But replacing structured justice with street justice, with emotion-led campaigns, leads to instability. Law must protect even the unpopular, even the despised, because once we allow emotion to dictate who deserves justice, tomorrow it might be you who is silenced. Jasmine Crockett, you frame this as a choice between structure and chaos. But that's not the real choice. The real question is, whose structure and whose chaos? For those sitting in positions of privilege, the system feels like order. For those at the bottom, it feels like oppression. When people protest, it's not to destroy the rule of law. It's to make the law finally see them. If your justice system demands silence to preserve peace, then it's not peace, it's control. Darshowitz, and yet, order is what allows protests to even exist. Congresswoman, the same Constitution you criticize is what protects your right to stand in that protest. It protects your speech, and mine. The true danger lies not in the system's imperfection, but in the belief that our individual moral judgment should override collective law. Once justice becomes personal, it stops being universal. Jasmine Carver, but Professor, the collective law was written by a very selective few. You say justice must remain universal. I agree. But to achieve that, we must first acknowledge its uneven history. I've sat in hearings where families of victims weep, while the system debates technicalities. I've seen courts that move mountains to protect the wealthy, but move inches when the poor plead for relief. If justice is blind, then it's blind in one eye. Dershowitz perhaps. But every generation has improved that vision. I lived through the civil rights movement, through Vietnam protests, through the battle for marriage equality. I've seen change, real change, come not from rage, but from persistence, from legal argument, from moral patience. Impatience can win a moment, discipline wins a century. Jasmine Crockett, and how many centuries should people wait? How many generations must say, the system will fix itself, while their lives are consumed by that waiting? Progress delayed is justice denied. The people you speak of, they're not angry because they don't understand the law. They're angry because they understand it too well. They see who it truly serves. JDG Margart, gentlemen and gentlewomen, please. This discussion is illuminating, but I must remind both parties. Our goal is not to indict the system, but to explore its definition. Professor Dershowitz, Congresswoman Crockett argues that justice should respond to the moral pulse of the people. How do you respond to the idea that law without empathy becomes tyranny? Drshowitz, Your Honor, empathy must inform justice, but it must never command it. A judge can feel compassion, but their ruling must rest on law. Otherwise, verdicts become inconsistent, unpredictable, dependent on who cries loudest, not who argues best. Empathy without discipline is sentiment. Justice without law is favoritism disguised as fairness. Jasmine Crockett. Then let's ask, what good is discipline if it serves no heart? A verdict may be lawful, but still immoral. A process may be fair on paper, but cruel in practice. Justice must have both structure and soul. And right now the soul is missing. Elan Dershowitz soul is not absent. It's preserved by the rule of law. When a defendant stands trial, we don't ask whether we feel they're guilty. We ask whether we can prove it. That separation between feeling and fact is civilization itself. If you erase that line, you turn justice into vengeance. Elegant, perhaps, in language, but lethal in practice. Jasmine Crockett. And if you draw that line too thickly, Professor, you turn justice into indifference. Law without empathy becomes machinery. It operates perfectly, but grinds people to dust in its gears. The system you defend is brilliant in theory, brutal in its detachment. The courtroom murmurs again. The tension is high. The judge leans forward, hands clasped. Judge Marguerite. Enough for today's rebuttal session. Both of you have drawn a powerful distinction, Professor Dershowitz, that justice must be defined through principle. Congresswoman Crockett, that justice must evolve through empathy. This court will move next into cross-interrogation, a direct exchange where each party questions the other's foundation of belief. Let us adjourn until tomorrow's session. By LIF, all rise. The United States Constitutional Review Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Margaret Leland presiding. Judge Marguerite, be seated. We continue our hearing on, who really defines justice? Today, each participant will question the other directly. Professor Adler, you may begin. Professor Adler, thank you, Your Honor. Representative Carver, yesterday you argued that justice must evolve with empathy. But empathy unrestrained can distort fairness. Let me ask plainly, when you weigh the pain of one group against another, who decides whose pain matters more? Representative Carver, no one should rank pain, Professor. Empathy is not a ledger, it's a lens. It allows us to see those historically ignored. When legislators craft policy without empathy, they legislate in blindness. The law may appear neutral, yet it deepens inequality. My argument is simple. Empathy doesn't choose sides, it ensures every side is visible. Professor Adler, visibility is admirable, but justice requires standards. If we rule by compassion alone, verdicts shift with mood. Consider sentencing. If a judge feels sympathy for a defendant's background, and another judge does not, we end up with two kinds of justice for the same crime. Consistency protects everyone, even those we dislike. Representative Carver, and consistency without conscience is cruelty. Two identical crimes may have identical sentences, but the contexts differ. Justice blindfolded to circumstance punishes desperation as harshly as greed. Law must ask not only what happened but why. Professor Adler, why is an endless corridor? Every act has reasons. If motive outweighs the act, law loses shape. Society cannot survive on permanent exceptions. You wish for flexibility, I fear for predictability. Citizens must know the boundaries of behavior. If law bends to every story, it breaks. Representative Carver, predictability should not mean paralysis. The law must adapt or it fossilizes. When citizens see no humanity in its application, they stop respecting it altogether. Order isn't threatened by compassion, it's strengthened by trust. Professor Adler, trust arises from reliability, not sympathy. A judge may care deeply yet must decide within statutes, or else we live under personal rule, not public rule. Tell me, Representative, if you faced a defendant whose actions harmed your constituents, could you truly separate your empathy from your politics? Representative Carver, yes. Because empathy doesn't mean favoritism. It means understanding. I can comprehend a person's suffering and still hold them accountable. Empathy informs fairness, it doesn't erase it. But, can you, Professor, separate tradition from ego? You defend the system because you helped build it. Isn't that its own bias? A ripple of murmurs. Judge Margaret raises her hand for silence. Professor Adler, fair question. I defend the system because it has protected liberty more reliably than any revolution. I have seen courts convict the guilty and restrain the powerful. When you tear down the wall for one just cause, you leave everyone exposed when a less just cause arrives. Representative Carver, walls can protect, but they also conceal. Our citizens watch executives evade punishment, watch marginalized people imprisoned for survival crimes, and they no longer believe that the wall shelters them. They see it as a fortress around privilege. Until that perception changes, structure inspires defiance, not respect. Professor Adler, then repair the wall, don't demolish it, strengthen oversight, increase transparency, but preserve the principle that truth requires evidence, not emotion. Justice demands that we sometimes defend the unpopular. It's easy to grant rights to those we love. The test of a society is whether we grant them to those we despise. Representative Carver, and yet, evidence itself is gathered by people, interpreted by people, filtered through bias. The process you call pure is human all the way down, recognizing that humanity doesn't weaken justice, it humbles it. It reminds us that verdicts should serve healing, not simply punishment. Professor Adler, healing is noble, justice is necessary. Confuse the two, and neither succeeds. If a judge's role becomes to comfort rather than to judge, guilt and innocence become sentimental notions. The law must sometimes be cold to remain clean. Representative Carver, clean perhaps, but sterile. Justice should not be heartless just to appear pure. A verdict without empathy may satisfy procedure but destroy public faith. When faith dies, law follows. We must infuse heart into the mechanism, or people will abandon the mechanism altogether. JDG Marguerite, let us pause here. Professor Adler, Representative Carver, each of you argues from principle. But I want this cross-examination to explore specifics. Professor Adler, do you believe the current system already embodies justice? Professor Adler, no, Your Honor. It strives for justice, it does not yet embody it, but it remains our best instrument. We can adjust sentencing guidelines, improve representation, curb prosecutorial excess, yet these must be measured reforms. Overcorrection risks imbalance. Representative Carver, measured reforms often arrive too late. When communities cry out, "We can't breathe," bureaucracy replies, "We'll study the matter." That delay is violence by paperwork. Swiftness is sometimes the only justice the powerless can feel. Professor Adler, rushed justice is injustice in disguise. Every wrongful conviction begins with urgency. Every mob verdict starts with certainty untested by doubt. Process is patience institutionalized. Representative, and every unpunished abuse begins with delay. Doubt becomes an excuse. We need more proof, they say, until memories fade and files disappear. The powerful weaponize your patience. How the courtroom hums, Judge Margaret intervenes. Judge Margaret, enough. Both points noted. We will proceed to the next phase, cross-examination by Representative Carver. You may now question Professor Adler. Representative Carver, Professor, you often say, justice must remain blind. But blind to what? To truth, to suffering. If blindness means ignoring reality, perhaps justice should see again. Professor Adler, it means blind to identity, to wealth, race, and rank. Every defendant stands equal before the law. That is the aspiration. Representative Carver, aspiration is not achievement. You speak of equality before the law, yet the outcomes scream inequality. Isn't insisting on blindness when vision is required a form of willful ignorance? Professor Adler, no, it's an act of discipline. We acknowledge inequality outside this room. Inside, we must neutralize it to the best of our ability. The alternative is to predetermine outcomes by social category, a path far darker. Representative Carver, but ignoring context produces the same darkness. Pretending neutrality while society bleeds isn't fairness. It's comfort. Real justice would keep the blindfold but lift it slightly to listen. Professor Adler, then perhaps justice needs better ears, not different eyes. Soft laughter from the gallery. Tension eases for a moment. Hirar Santa Carvia Toche, Professor. But ears require heart to translate what they hear. You insist that law is the spine of civilization. I agree. But even a spine must bend or it snaps. PRSR Adlard, and if it bends too far it collapses. Balance. That is the eternal burden of justice. JUDGE Margard, enough for this morning. This exchange captures the essence of our dilemma. Can empathy and order coexist without corrupting one another? Tomorrow's session will continue the cross-examination and invite final reflections before closing arguments. Court is adjourned. BALIF, all rise. JUDGE Margaret, be seated. We resume proceedings in the People vs. the idea of justice. Representative Carver, you have the floor for continued questioning. Representative Carver, thank you, Your Honor. Professor Adler, earlier you said, process is patience institutionalized. Tell me, what do you say to the families who wait decades for justice that never arrives? Professor Adler, I say that delay, though agonizing, is preferable to error. The integrity of justice depends not on speed but on accuracy. If we rush verdicts to soothe pain, we risk condemning the innocent. That is not justice, it's vengeance with paperwork. And yet, the innocent still suffer while the system deliberates. You speak as though time is neutral. It isn't. Time favors those with power, those who can afford lawyers, appeals, and influence. The poor cannot wait decades. The hungry cannot wait for reform. Professor Adler, and the innocent cannot afford mistakes. I understand frustration, but haste does not equal progress. Law is the art of restraint. Passion may start revolutions, but restraint sustains civilization. Representative Carver, civilization, Professor, was built on the backs of the restrained. Those told to wait just a little longer. You call it restraint, they call it suffocation. How many must endure wrongful silence before patience becomes complicity? The crowd murmurs. The judge signals for order. Professor Adler. Complicity lies in corruption, not in caution. You confuse delay with indifference. The law's slow pace is not disregard, it's diligence. Justice cannot run on outrage. Representative Carver, outrage is what woke this country from its sleep, Professor. Without outrage, the law would still call segregation order. It would still label protest disorder. Your caution would have preserved injustice with perfect paperwork. Professor Adler, and your outrage, unchecked, could ignite chaos with righteous fury. Every dictator in history began by claiming moral urgency. I fear passion without principle far more than delay. Representative Carver, that's convenient, Professor, to equate activism with anarchy, passion without principle, or perhaps principle without compassion. You hide behind the word stability because instability threatens comfort. Professor Adler, no, because instability threatens liberty. When laws shift with emotion, no citizen is safe. Even you, Representative, would one day find yourself accused by the same passions you unleashed. The air tightens. Representative Carver leans forward, voice low, trembling but firm. Carver, do you know why people cheer for instability, Professor? Because the stable world never worked for them. They live in neighborhoods where laws protect property, not people. Where the poor man's mistake is a felony, and the rich man's crime is a fine. You speak of liberty, but whose liberty? Gasps from the audience. The judge glances sharply. JUDG Margaret, order please. Continue, Representative, but remain within decorum. Representative Carver, yes, Your Honor. Professor, your version of justice is clean, but it's sterile. It's built to function, not to feel. When a mother buries her son, does she care that the system is methodical? When evidence disappears because an officer forgot to file it, does your precious patience comfort her? Professor Adler, no words can comfort grief. Grief cannot guide verdicts. Emotion may illuminate suffering, but law must translate it into principle. If every case becomes personal, justice becomes tribal, one pain competing with another. Representative Carver, justice already is tribal, Professor. We just pretend it's not. The tribes are wealth, race, and influence. You call it impartiality, I call it selective blindness. You built a system that sees clearly when the defendant wears a tie, but goes blind when he wears a hoodie. A hushed silence falls. The judge's gavel strikes once. Gently this time. He Judg Margaret Representative toned down the rhetoric. Continue your line of questioning. Representative Carver, of course, Your Honor. Professor, do you believe justice should evolve as society changes? Professor Adler, yes. But carefully. Evolution, not mutation. Principles are like the Constitution, amendable, not disposable. When justice bends, it must bend toward reason, not rage. Rapar asks the silent Carviar, and who decides when it's reason and when it's rage? The same institutions that benefit from calling their comfort order. Your moderation often looks like preservation. A slower injustice still poisons the same. Professor Adler, perhaps, but revolution without reflection is self-destruction. Law's slowness is not always cowardice. Sometimes it's conscience. If we rewrite morality every time emotion surges, we lose moral memory itself. Carver walks to the center, voice lowering into something almost personal. Carver, Professor, with all respect, have you ever been on the other side? Have you ever been profiled, silenced, or disbelieved just for existing in the wrong body, the wrong street, the wrong hour? Officer Adler, no, I will not pretend I have. Then you debate from safety, you theorize from comfort. Justice, to you, is a subject. To us, it's survival. Adler, and survival depends on structure, Representative. The very system you criticize is the one that allows you to stand here and challenge it. Without it, speech becomes treason and trials become executions. We must reform the house, not burn it down. Representative Carver, sometimes the house is so rotten, the foundation must be shattered to rebuild. How many floors can collapse before repair becomes delusion? Officer Adler, break it entirely, and chaos rushes in faster than justice. Reform demands courage, yes, but also discipline. Justice must not feel good, it must be right. Representative Carver, and being right shouldn't mean being cold. People don't lose faith in justice because it's imperfect, they lose faith because it's indifferent. The judge interjects, Judg Margartai, enough. Both of you raise profound truths. But remember, this is not just philosophy. It's policy. Professor Adler, if you had the power to reform one element of the justice system immediately, what would it be? Professor Adler, transparency. Every prosecutorial decision, every plea bargain, should be open to public review. Sunlight cures corruption faster than slogans. Jdg Margaret Representative Carver, same question. Representative Carver, accessibility. Justice should speak every language, reach every class, understand every face. We cannot call it a system if half the citizens can't afford to enter it. J.G. Margar, R.E. Both answers reveal the heart of our dilemma. Transparency without access is hollow, access without transparency is blind. Perhaps justice requires both sight and touch. Continue, but we are nearing closing statements. Representative Carver, Professor, you've built a life teaching that justice must resist emotion. But tell me this, what made you choose law? Surely not indifference. Professor Adler smiles faintly, you're right. I was 17 when I watched my father accused of a crime he didn't commit. The prosecutor was ruthless, the evidence was circumstantial, but one old judge insisted on process. That process, slow, methodical, unyielding, saved him. That day I learned, emotion can ignite justice but only discipline can preserve it. Representative Carver, then perhaps we aren't so different. My mother spent years cleaning offices of men who wrote laws they'd never feel. I watched her bow to systems that treated her as invisible. That's why I fight, not to destroy law, but to remind it of the faces beneath its pages. A long silence fills the room. Even the judge's eyes soften. A Judg Margaret, this court is rare. We do not seek a verdict between two citizens, but between two philosophies. Let us conclude today's testimony here. Tomorrow, Both of you will deliver your closing arguments. Professor Adler, defending justice as structure. Representative Carver, defending justice as conscience. Court adjourned. Gavel falls. The two adversaries exchange a look, not of hostility, but of mutual understanding. The crowd rises. Fade out. BALIF. All rise. JDGE Margaret. This session reconvenes for closing statements. Professor Adler, you may begin. Professor Adler. Your Honor, members of this court, justice is not a feeling we chase, but a framework we build. We've heard passionate arguments about pain, inequality, and history. Each true. Yet the law cannot survive if it moves only where emotion points. Justice must be the slow heartbeat of principle. Impartial, deliberate, and predictable. So even those we despise know what to expect. Predictability is fairness. Reform, yes. Empathy, yes. But if we allow anger, even righteous anger, to rewrite standards by impulse, tomorrow's justice will depend on tomorrow's outrage. Let compassion inform the law, not replace it. Let the system bend to include more voices, not break under the noise of many. Justice must be blind not because it refuses to see suffering, but because it refuses to look away from truth. Thank you. He nods respectfully and sits. Murmurs ripple through the courtroom. PJUDG Margaret. Representative Carver, your closing statement. Representative IV Carver. Your Honor, and all who listen. Justice, that never feels the people's pulse, becomes hollow. We built courts to protect the living, not to worship process. If the law cannot recognize the humanity beneath its paperwork, it risks defending fairness on paper while denying it in practice. Rules matter, but rules must serve life. We do not ask the system to run on outrage, we ask it to remember why it exists. Every amendment, every civil rights statute, every moral leap in our history began with someone saying, "The law is not enough." Justice is not blind, it's learning to see further. So yes, Professor, we must preserve principle. But principle must never silence pain. Let our laws evolve, not decay, breathing with the people they serve. A long pause. The judge looks between them. PJUDGE Margaret, you both defend opposite sides of the same coin. One of structure, one of soul. Perhaps justice is not a fixed statue or a shifting tide, but a bridge between the two, built by reason, strengthened by empathy. There is no verdict here today, only reflection, because the true answer to who defines justice is simple. We all do every time we choose fairness over comfort. Court is adjourned. Justice isn't what's written, it's what's lived. Subscribe to the Debate Archives for more powerful moments where truth meets principle.